Hello! Welcome to this optional video. If you just realized it was optional, you can close out right now. About trying to introduce you to your textbook, which I think will be one of your three best friends this year, so too bad for your third best friend. You're going at some point in hopefully the near future to be issued by the school a copy of Ways of the World, A Brief Global History by Robert Strayer. You might get the second edition, you might get the third edition, you might get the fourth value edition, which is actually in better condition than the other two. Functionally, they are all the same, although it's worth noting that I align most of my reading guides to the second edition, which is what I have at home. The author is my personal friend, Robert Strayer, professor of history, I forget where. I prefer to think of him here as seen somewhere on vacation in this delightful shirt. Somebody somewhere has used the powers of the internet to create a Twitter account called @BobbyStrayerFan. And the less said about that, the better. Anyway, Ways the World is going to be your constant companion. You are going to resent it. You are probably already a little bit upset about it. So I thought I would take a second to talk about why I'm going to make you spend a bunch of your life with this textbook, even though the fashionable thing in education these days is to deride or criticize teaching from the textbook. Nonetheless, we're going to do it in this course for basically three reasons. The first one is to get factual information. The most important things I'm going to teach you in this class are to be analytical about history. But in order to be analytical about history, in order to think critically, in order to make arguments, you need to know a bunch of facts. And it's the most efficient way of giving you that factual information is to use a textbook. The alternative would be for me to spend a huge amount of our time together just talking at you, and everybody knows that's a terrible idea. So the main reason why we use the textbook is that it's your responsibility to go to that book once or twice a week, get factual information, and then bring that knowledge to class so that we can practice those higher level skills that you actually need me there for to work on. The second thing is just to make sure that a pretty broad and representative sample of human history is covered in your knowledge. I am not an expert in all of world history. I'm actually not an expert in the vast majority of world history. And so, courtesy of Robert Strayer, I can ensure that you're going to get kind of coverage of the broad sweep of human history, even when my own knowledge of a subject is limited. We're going to focus in on some specific events in class, but it's the textbook that really is going to make sure that you don't get to a situation where you're taking my exam in January or you're taking the AP exam in May and something pops up that we didn't talk about in class and you absolutely have never heard of it. The textbook is there to cover you. Finally, and a little bit more interestingly, textbooks attempt to present history in a neutral way, but they all reflect bias. Their authors all have to make choices about what's important and what's not, about what causal theories to present and which ones they think aren't worth putting in the textbook. And so even though the textbook is mostly going to be used for factual information, it's still presenting a specific interpretation of history. And occasionally we're actually going to be able to put on our critical glasses and think about how Strayer is choosing to present history as opposed to how other textbook authors or how other scholars might choose to present the same factual information. So once in a while, we'll be able to actually look critically at the textbook in addition to just trying to mine some facts out of that book. Every Thursday, more or less, you're going to have a big chunk of reading due. It's generally going to be a chapter. It might also incorporate one or two sections from a different chapter. And so let's walk through the procedure that you need to go through every time you have a reading due. And I will tell you now for the first of many, many, many times, whether or not you're going to listen to me, that you should not start the reading on the night before it's due. Now I can say I told you so. All right. So when you are thinking about your reading homework, here are the steps you want to follow. Number one, there is a reading guide that actually outlines all of your reading for the year. And you want to look at that first. So if I'm doing my first reading, I'm going to find that first little table in the reading guide. I'm going to see up top that the topic is East Asia. I'm going to see here that I have to read two things. One of those is the entire chapter, China and the World. And then the other one, denoted by these quotation marks, is a section from chapter 7 titled Silk Roads, Exchange Across Eurasia. And I'll try and put notes in here so you're clear when you're assigned to read a whole chapter versus a section. But please feel free to ask the Google chat if you are unclear on which is which. I'm going to give you generally a couple of guiding questions to shape your understanding of the textbook, because there's a ton of information in each of these chapters, and I want you to be able to focus on answering these guiding questions. Then at the bottom, I'm going to give you a significant but hopefully manageable list of key terms. And you are accountable for the definitions of each and every one of those terms. You need to be able by the end of this unit to just tell me what the Silk Roads were. And actually, apparently, I'm now noticing it's so important that I've put on this reading guide twice. You want to look at the reading guide first. You want to read the whole thing before you sit down and open your textbook. Second thing, you're going to read the text, you're going to take notes. And I'll talk a little bit later, and we'll talk a little bit in class about the mechanics of what taking notes look like. Third thing, you're going to turn in your notes. You're going to take a photograph. And the reason you have to take a photograph is because I am requiring you to handwrite your notes. I know that this is archaic. I know that it is a practice invented for torture purposes during the 13th century, and you got to do it anyway. I'm happy to talk with you individually about why, but unless we have a specific agreement, and I don't think I've ever done this before at CRLS, you have to handwrite your notes. Take a photo of those when they're all done, turn them in on Google Classroom. There will be an assignment posted every week. That's most of your homework credit. Finally, I'm going to post a self-assessment quiz. This, like your homework notes, is graded for completion, not for accuracy, but I do want you to have a chance to test your understanding, your choice about whether to use your notes, to use the book or not when you take that quiz, but my recommendation is that you try and do as many of those questions as you can from memory to test how well that knowledge has stuck. Two formats in which you might take notes, and we'll talk about this some more in class, and I'll point you to some other resources if you're interested in exploring either of these formats. One possibility, which you see here on the left, is outline notes. You organize the information hierarchically. You have these big headings. You indent a line or a quarter of an inch or whatever, and then you do some bullet points. And if you need to, have even more detailed, specific, perhaps trivial stuff, you indent some more, right? The second possibility is what we call Cornell notes. You draw a line about a third of the way from the left of the paper. On the right-hand side, you take your notes as you read, bullet point format, and then after you're done reading, you go back on the left-hand side, write down some headings, some keywords, some questions. So what you're doing is doing the smaller bullet points first and putting the headings on later. Write a summary for yourself at the bottom. You can go back and underline key terms, highlight according to themes you're seeing here. That's a slightly more structured format for notes, but a lot of students who struggle with textbook readings have found that Cornell Notes really helps them out in terms of making it more manageable and creating a good reference guide for themselves. So you might want to consider that. And again, I'll give you some resources for practicing those two note formats or getting some more tips for those note formats in the description of this video and linked in my reading guide. Feel free to play around with what works for you. If there is a different format which works better for you and you've practiced it in your previous classes and you know that that's the way you want to take notes, that's cool. Everybody's brain works a little bit differently. But if you're planning to use a format other than these two formats, you might just want to shoot me an email before the first assignment is due so that you can be sure that you're going to meet my standards and earn credit for your work. Finally, just a couple of note-taking tips. These tend to be the first things that I tell students when they say that they're really struggling with the textbook reading, like it's taking them forever or like they're not retaining anything. So if you're running into trouble, try these things first and then talk to me. I'm happy to try and help. Number one, you got to write by hand. You retain a lot more information this way, and more importantly, you become more selective about what you write down. Often students who it takes them 3 or 4 hours to do the homework. The reason that it takes forever is because they're essentially just copying out the entire text, and I don't want you taking notes at that level of detail. And that's part of the reason why writing by hand is actually advantageous, is because it is just too annoying when you write by hand to write excessively detailed notes. Second suggestion is that you really need to put the textbook into your own words. This is going to slow you down at first, but it's what makes sure that your brain is actually doing work while you're taking notes, as opposed to like sort of watching TV, sort of texting your friend, and sort of doing your history homework. So put everything into your own words. That's also helpful for just making sure that if you're later writing a paper from the notes that you took for this class, you don't accidentally plagiarize Robert Strayer because you accidentally copied 3 sentences from his textbook. Thing number 3, don't look at the book while you're writing. Don't keep glancing back and forth between your notebook and the textbook and your notebook and the textbook. See if you can, read the information, internalize it, get it stuck in your head, and then go over to your notes and write that information down there without glancing back at the book. Thing number four, you want to break up the reading. If you are reading one sentence, taking note, reading one sentence, taking note, it's going to take you ages and ages and ages to get through an entire chapter. So my recommendation would be that you pause after every paragraph at the absolute, that's the absolute smallest chunk that I think you should pause after in order to write down notes. I wouldn't recommend doing more than a section or a subsection at the time. Strayer is really good about having sections and subsections that kind of break down the reading into manageable chunks. I would definitely not attempt to read an entire chapter and then write down your notes on the entire chapter. That's generally going to lead you to leave out some really important details. But I would suggest reading at least a paragraph at a time before you go over to your notes. Finally, and I think most importantly, it's really helpful in your notes and it's really helpful in learning in general when you make connections between things that you're learning about from the textbook, or for that matter, from a lecture that you're watching, and things that are already in your head, right? And this might not make sense unless you, for some reason, have really studied, Song Dynasty China when you do the first reading. But even then, you should have watched my preview video before you go to read that chapter. So you might want to start making connections, making comparisons, right? So if you go to Strayer and you read that in Song Dynasty China, they're using civil service exams, you might remember from my preview video that actually, this practice originated like 1,000 years before that in the Han Dynasty. And so you might want to just make a little note in the margins of your notebook so that you can, take the information that you're getting out of the textbook and kind of hang it on the framework of your prior knowledge. That's the way that your brain builds connections. That's the way that you really retain stuff. So make connections in your brain. You might want to write them down in your notes as well, but don't be afraid to pause in your reading and say, hey, I've heard of that. I think I read it 2 chapters ago. Let me just flip back and look, because it's those connections that really help you solidify your learning and your memory. Last thing I'm going to say, ask for help. This is difficult. It is okay if you struggle with this. It does not mean you are a bad student. This is a college level textbook. For many of you, it is going to be the first time that you have really had to read and engage with a textbook at this speed and in this volume. This is not an easy thing to do. So please, please, please ask me for help. This is what office hours are for. Ask your classmates for help if you're getting stuck. As long as you're paying attention to the academic honesty guidelines in my syllabus, you are absolutely okay to talk to other people about note-taking strategies. I'm really happy to look at your notes, especially if you think that this is taking you forever, or it's really stressing you out, or it feels completely impossible to do in a timely fashion. I'm here to help. So please book an appointment or shoot me an email, and I will do anything I can to make this a more manageable task, short of excusing you from the notes, because I generally am not going to do that. All right, that's it. Good luck. I will look forward to looking at your first textbook notes quite soon.